you to our session today. I'm Helena Wilkinson, Head of Charities and Not-for-Profit at Price Bailey, and I'm delighted that we're running these events with BDB Pitmans on how to prepare charities for the future and what the tomorrow looks like. Today we're covering fundraising and governance, and we have speakers from BDB of Jonathan and Kate, who will be starting off, and then Suzanne will be speaking a bit later from Price Bailey. If you've got any technical issues, then please use the chat function to let us know, and we'll try and resolve them for you. And we'd be delighted to take your questions through the Q&A, and we'll answer those at the end of the session. It will run for half an hour, and then we'll have about 15 minutes of questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jonathan.
Great, thanks, Helena. Melissa, can we scroll through to I think it's slide 3. Great. Yes, thank you. So over the course of my allotted 7 minutes, I'm going to talk about how we've started to see ESG principles being adopted in the private sector as a management tool, and how we think it is probably inevitable that the charity of tomorrow will be obliged to follow suit, and how that may well end up being a good thing for the organisation and indeed the sector. But first, a quick recap on, yes, we're on the right screen, sorry. But first, a quick recap about ESG. So this is a term that stands for environmental, social and governance. And charities with funds to invest will in recent times probably have been inundated with various ESG investment opportunities which are being promoted by banks and investment managers. And what this means is that an investment opportunity, in addition to everything else, is also scrutinized through an ESG lens in terms of the extent to which the company in question is adhering to environmental, social, or governance best practice in creating whatever product or service they sell. It is then given an ESG rating, and a view is then taken about the financial performance or value of that investment based on that ESG rating. And the received wisdom is that companies with a good ESG rating will perform better over the long term, because fundamentally they have a more sustainable work practice when compared to companies with a poor ESG rating who will not perform as well. And the financial data is starting to support that proposition. And there is no doubt that there is an enormous appetite for ESG orientated investments. And we have seen investors channel an eye-watering $40 trillion into ESG and impact investments during the course of the last 2 years or so. However, ESG has moved beyond simply being an investment device and has now become management shorthand for talking about values, ethical behavior, and sustainability generally. So we now see ESG being used by companies in the private sector as a way of articulating their culture and values to customers, and to showcase governance initiatives like diversity, equity, and inclusion. It also provides a platform for companies to shout about their positive impact and highlight the more compassionate side of their business. So why are they doing this? Well, not only are ESG ratings tilting the financial markets, but it is becoming increasingly apparent that people don't want to purchase from or work for companies that are destroying the environment, or use child labor, or subject their employees to unfair working conditions. And the ESG phenomenon has been supercharged by a number of overlapping societal issues, including the pandemic, the prominence of the Me Too and the Black Lives Matter movements, the social media cancel culture, and a generally heightened awareness of climate change, which means that the operating environment for businesses has changed enormously in a very short space of time. All of this has greatly altered expectations about how companies should do business, and those expectations are only going to become more pronounced. So we've seen ESG migrate from an investment classification to a broader management tool for private companies, and now, inevitably, we are starting to see a growing pressure on charities to follow suit and demonstrate how they adhere to ESG factors in terms of their day-to-day activities. Can we change the slide, please, Melissa? So at first blush, there might not appear to be an obvious incentive for a charity to engage with this kind of reporting standard. Indeed, these may feel like something of a distraction from the day-to-day charitable activities to which the organization is dedicated. However, what is important to remember is that ESG goes beyond thinking about the quality of the charitable output and instead obliges you to think about the methodology and practice of the organization as a whole. It focuses very much on the how of an organization rather than the what. In one sense, it expands the concept of public benefit to encompass not only the services or grant-making function of the charity, but the organization as a whole, in terms of how they invest their money, the funders from whom they are willing to take money, the fairness of their working practices, the transparency of their governance, and having some regard to the environmental consequences of their activities. So what are the potential benefits to integrating ESG into the organization? Well, these could potentially be quite numerous and could include improved governance transparency, improved risk management, enhanced brand value and reputation, demonstrating a better understanding of stakeholder and beneficiary requirements, improved staff recruitment and motivation, and improved accountability and trust. Melissa, could you swap the slide, please? But apart from these potential organizational benefits, we are seeing funding decisions becoming increasingly nuanced with a growing emphasis on ESG-related issues. For example, funders may want to understand your organization's approach to the question of diversity or beneficiary representation, the robustness of your corporate governance, what due diligence you carry out on significant donors, as well as considerations about environmental impact. And because ESG reporting requires a greater level of transparency across these areas, it enables you more readily to address these types of concerns and provide the requisite information to funders to enable them to make a decision. Can we swap the slide, please, Melissa? So how should a charity start the conversation about ESG integration? Well, it should probably start with the board asking themselves the following types of questions. Could the charitable purposes of the organization be better served by adopting an ESG approach? Could the charity use its resources more efficiently? Could ESG help with the recruitment of staff and supporters? Could ESG help to manage reputational risk and promote a positive culture, values, and behaviors? Could ESG reporting help to improve public trust and confidence in terms of being more open and transparent? And could an ESG approach potentially help to cement existing funding relationships and open up other funding opportunities? If the answer to some or all of those questions is yes, then it would seem likely that an ESG strategy would benefit the organization in helping to achieve its charitable aims. So to conclude, I would highlight that ESG has gone from the periphery to the mainstream in a very short space of time. So I don't think organizations should beat themselves up for not yet having grappled with the issue. That said, as this approach becomes the norm, ESG information will likely cause donors, volunteers, employees to factor in these ratings when deciding what organization to support or work for. And it is not unlikely that they would opt in favor of an organization that takes sustainability and ESG practices seriously when making those decisions. And over the long term, they will certainly impact positively and indeed negatively on the future success of an organization. So thanks very much. And with that, I will pass over to Kate.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was, yeah, topical, I should think. Thanks, that's the right slide. I'm Kate Parkinson. I'm a charity lawyer based here in Cambridge. I'm going to pick up on some of the themes of governance that Jonathan's already touched on, and then look at briefly whether or not a charity can consider whether or not its social mission sort of reflects where it is today in the new world. So the last 18 months have brought about, a number of changes that necessarily need to be distilled into charity operations. Some strong governance really is the backbone which charities can rely on to hold them together as they look to move quickly and decisively with the times. And so reviewing the realities of the front line really should be distilled in likewise in the governance and the policies that sit behind them, equipping charities for tomorrow and the tools that they need to thrive. The change in the way the world operates means that it might be time to make some space for a governance review. On the agenda should likely be making sure your safeguarding policy is up to date. Safeguarding has been a hot topic for the Charity Commission for some time, and this seems set to continue, as you might expect, particularly in relation to events and service delivery moving online. And I know that Suzanne's going to talk to us some more about fundraising and regulation in this area in particular. We've worked with a number of charities providing increased online or perhaps even telephone counselling or mentoring, for example. And the response to this has been to see more charities increasing their monitoring and sampling for quality and safeguarding purposes. This clearly should be backed up by strong policies to ensure accountability and proper oversight, as well as documenting the proper escalation procedures if necessary. And please remember that responsibility of safeguarding extends to everyone that comes into contact with the charity, which includes employees and volunteers. And so just a reminder really that safeguarding policies should address internal measures as well as those external facing ones of beneficiaries. And perhaps another policy or perhaps strategy again, which Jonathan touched on, is equality and diversity in charities. The last 18 months have seen, all sectors considering their work in bettering diversity with Black Lives Matter movements, and again, the way in which the pandemic disproportionately and arguably sort of affected certain communities. From discussing this with charities and consultants in the area, I've certainly learned that, again, starting the conversation is key, and that the answers aren't always apparent first time, but everyone, has to start somewhere. When we get there, the next link, I've just noted some EDI resources there, and top of the list is oh sorry, can we move back, Melissa? I realized I might make that happen. And top of the list when we get there is that it's a statement there from the CEO of Macmillan, and they've sort of been quite honest and frank about where they are in their EDI journey, and the top link is a statement from their CEO just sort of saying where they find they are and where they aspire to be. Again, just tying in with another Jonathan's points, and that's in financial investments and the charity's capacity to sort of make sure that their investments are bettering their aims and their missions. The Charity Commission has recently consulted on their guidance in this area, and so watch this space for its updated guidance, which us in the sector are hoping are going to be a bit more of a friendly pointer towards how charities can really make an impact with their sort of investment strategies. An example of this is a charity that works in health and choosing to sort of steer away from companies that invest in tobaccos, for example, or environmental charities choosing to invest in renewable energy sector. So the charity of tomorrow really should feel empowered to handle their investment strategies and ESG strategies when you get there with the conversation, as per their policies, which you should be taking time to reflect upon. Just very quickly moving on to the last two bullet points, in thinking ahead and reacting towards sort of anticipated social changes, trustees should not lose sight of the charity's aspirations and strategy and sort of strategic moves towards where they want to be. A governance review can be a very good tool in this, and part of that may well be whether or not, since you started operating and where you find yourself now, there's another person or another charity operating in your space, and as we look down the barrel of whether or not we may be looking at a decreased income for some families, whether or not you want to be joining forces and making the most of the resources available to you. So next slide, please. Melissa, sorry. And there they are. There's all the resources, and the slides will be available after if you want to sort of just take a quick look down on any of those to help inform your conversation on EDI. And next slide, please, Melissa. Great. So very quickly, looking to tomorrow, charities may be facing up to the reality that where they've come from doesn't quite match up with where they want to be. And definitely part of that we see is that charitable objects don't, or charitable as being the legal phrasing of the purposes in your constitution, don't really reflect a practical or appropriate way to meet the need that you've identified in the space that you work. And charities could be realizing this for a number of reasons, or perhaps need to modernize their wording so that they're Equality Act compliant, for example, so you're not unnecessarily discriminating. As you'll appreciate, charities must act within the scope of their objects, but they can expand these, provided the new objects are exclusively charitable. The trustee's decision to make the change, makes sense, as you might expect, and importantly, that the objects don't undermine where the charity has come from, so the work that they are still doing in their sort of sector. So amending objects is generally what's known as a regulated alteration, which means that because it has a capacity to change the way in which the charity can spend its funds, the Charity Commission needs to give consent in advance, apart from a few exceptions, but we won't go into those now. So at a high level, as long as the objects are, as mentioned, don't undermine where the charity is at the moment, and the trustees show why they consider the changes to be reasonable in the circumstances, the Commission really should hopefully consent to the changes if the revised objects, even if the revised objects are significantly different from the existing ones. For example, as long as the objects, are exclusively charitable, the Commission should consent to an extension to the, to a wider beneficial class. For example, trying to reach a sort of greater number of people in a bigger geographical area, and we would expect them to consent to an adoption of an additional purpose for the an unchanged beneficiary class. So, for example, serving ex-personnel but providing ex-service personnel but providing training as well as counselling. Naturally, as you might have expected, a lot of charities wanted to help in response to the pandemic, no matter their main object. The Commission noted at the time that charities with certain objects may be able to adapt to respond to the coronavirus, either directly or indirectly. For example, a charity with an object to advance religion may have been able to support as part of its pastoral work, or charities that work in the arts could have, helped relieve isolation through their online work. The Charity Commission at the time did prioritise applications that looked to expand objects as the pandemic hit, and charities looking to address that. But I actually don't have sight of how many applications it approved. But what I'm hearing from the Commission is that the normal tests still apply, and so the practical reality of whether or not the charity is going to be affecting what it does and has the sort of capacity and reasoning to expand where they're going is still going to be paramount when considering applications. And so it really just comes back to that overarching point about feeding into whether or not your governance and the policies and everything that sits behind the very important frontline work that you do is setting you up to sort of fly when it comes to achieving those things that you've identified as being important to you in the future. And on that was a stop door. I'm now going to stop and pass the baton over very quickly over to Suzanne, who's a Senior Manager at Price Bailey, and is going to talk to us about fundraising regulation. Thanks, Suzanne.
That's lovely. Thank you, Kate and Jonathan. Yes, whistle-stop tours, I think, are the order of the day. And I'm going to talk to you about fundraising and regulation, which, is a very wide-ranging topic. So I'm going to hone in on fundraising regulation today, what it means as a result of the pandemic and what it means going forwards for organisations within the charity and not-for-profit space. So if we can start with the first slide, please, Melissa. Thank you. So I say I'm going to focus on today, but actually, if we just roll back the clock a few years and we start a few years ago, charities and fundraising did receive some really bad press, and I'm sure you will recall particularly the Olive Cook case, which happened way back in 2014 now, but still feels a little bit like yesterday. Olive Cook, of course, was a poppy seller who was inundated with fundraising requests on a weekly basis, and these were all discovered, unfortunately, when she deceased. As a result of that case in particular, then there was an independent review of fundraising that was commissioned, and we saw a new regulator of fundraising as a result of that, actually named the Fundraising Regulator. And that was because the public trust and confidence in charities had really started to decline. So moving to today then, and in 2021, we've seen, particularly as a result of the pandemic, actually, and some of the actions that have happened during the pandemic, like the use of food banks for families, food vouchers for children in schools, and of course the wonderful work of the late Captain Tom Moore. You know, those sorts of positive press and media stories have seen that the public trust and confidence in charities has increased a little bit as a result of the pandemic. And I think that's a real positive that we can take here. So the Charity Commission have been undertaking a review of public trust and confidence in charities over a number of years. And what we're seeing now, that out of a score of 10 in 2021, public trust and confidence was up to 6.4. Now, back in 2017, that score was 6.7 out of 10, and that was pre the Olive Cup case that I just mentioned. It declined quite rapidly for a number of years after that, within the 5. So it's good to see that it is coming back slightly. Now, along with this Charity Commission review, it's interesting to see that only 54% of charities in the last review were correctly reporting public benefit in their accounts. And obviously this is absolutely a key part of restoring that public perception, if you like, in charities. So there's 2 things that we expect to see in sets of accounts, or the Commission expect to see, and of course, us at Price Bailey as auditors of statutory sets of accounts would expect to see. The first is to confirm whether the charity had regard to the Charity Commission guidance on public benefit. And often that is just a sentence within the report to confirm that the charity did have that due regard. The next bit is the more important bit, and that's the explanation of the activities of the organisation and what it does to further the public benefit. You know, explanation of what it's there for, what its aims and objectives are, how it achieves those, and you know how it spends those funds that they raise from the public. If we can move to the next slide, please, Melissa. That's lovely, thank you. So Helena, who started us off today, Helena is our head of charities and profit at Price Bailey, and she does an annual review for charity finance of the top 100 trustees reports every year. It's really important that the trustees annual report is a tool to provide that transparent view of how your charity operates and spends the funds that are provided by the public and by other bodies. And this review found then that 96% overall had started to clearly tie back within their trustees report their aims and objectives, what they're there to achieve, and how they're doing it. The statistics here on the far right hand side help to explain really how funds are being spent, and there's numerous ways in which you can do that within your report. So Helena has very helpfully pulled out some key statistics here to see how people are doing that. So the top 3 are looking positive, although we've got a 40% there. Now we've got 56% articulated their strategy and how they manage success. 40% have at least a brief overview of their strategy and success measures. And 79% had a detailed explanation of why reserves were held for the charity. And I'm sure those who are fortunate enough to have reserves have dipped into them substantially as a result of the pandemic. Now, these first 3 really indicate the direction, the future direction of regulation for charities and what we're expecting to see in their trustees reports going forward. So the next SORP, which is the charity regulation that governs the preparation of the accounts, that's expected to change now, probably in 2024, 2025. And we would expect to see more emphasis placed on some of these explanations within the trustees report going forwards. The bottom 2 are with regards to transparency over salaries and benefits for both the management team and the CEO. Now, some reports already do that, particularly for the CEO, but it's not surprising that those are in the lower end of disclosures at the moment. And you know, it's not a statutory requirement yet, but you know, watch this space, because it's certainly something that's of keen interest in the sector, and something as well which can gain bad press from time to time, and then of course diminishes that all-important public trust and confidence in charities. If we can move to the next slide, please, Melissa, that'd be great. Thank you. So put together then the trustees' annual report at the front of the accounts, with the numbers at the back of the accounts, provides a picture of what the charity has done. So we call that its outputs, and what it's achieved, we call that its outcomes. And then the difference that it makes to society as a whole, otherwise known as its impact. So we often talk about outcomes, outputs and impact with regards to charity reporting. This is just a little explanation there as to what that means. So trustees should consider, how do you deliver your mission, and how do you monitor that? How do you show the public what you are there to achieve, and how do you achieve it? Now, of course, not all trustees on a board are financially minded, and of course, a diverse board of trustees should consider many different skills on the board, many different skill sets, so that they can all contribute their own individual experience and their knowledge, so that they can make effective decisions for the charity and ensure that it delivers on those aims and objectives. Trustees should have a good grasp of the numbers, though, even if they're not financially minded, so that they can decide how successful or not they are. And a balanced scorecard approach is a good way to help trustees do that. You know, so you might be asking yourself, how do we know if we're doing the right things? And a balanced scorecard really captures more than just the finances for an organisation. It considers also the beneficiaries, or the customers, if you like. You know, it considers internal processes and procedures, and a lot of those will have changed substantially as a result of the pandemic, and we're going to move on to digital transformation in a moment, you know. And then it brings all of that together and considers the goals of the organisation, and helps trustees to focus on how they're going to achieve those goals. So a balanced scorecard approach can really help you to understand what you're doing and why, and how you're achieving it. If we can move on, please, Melissa. So I said we'd talk about digital transformation. In 2021 and going forwards, fundraising and regulation has obviously seen massive advances in digital transformation. And so also have operational aspects of the organisation, you know, so processes and procedures that were once manual have now been digitised in many respects, but they've been done quickly. And I think the important message here really is that you need to make sure that you're updating your policies and procedures going forwards to ensure that those quick fixes that you had during the pandemic operate effectively and allow you to continue to fundraise going forwards. If we move on, please, Melissa. That's great. Thank you. Obviously, the use of digital technologies also brings with it a raft of legislation. And we've got some examples here of the various types of legislation that to think about with regards to fundraising and also digital fundraising. You know, some of these have been around for many years. So the Code of Fundraising Practice has been around for many years, although it has been updated a few times as well. The Fundraising Regulator I spoke about just briefly earlier was a result of bringing in that review of fundraising and trying to increase the public perception of charities and the fundraising that they do. And of course, the ICO, is an important part of looking at data protection. Can we move on, please, Melissa? Again, what we've seen, however, are that there are numerous media stories which impact upon public trust and confidence in charities, and hence their ability to fundraise. And what we've got on this slide here are a number of those cases that have been in the press recently from the ICO. Cybercrime is, of course, the crime of our times, and it's really important, I would say, that training is given to all members of your organisations, trustees, CEO, other staff members should all receive important training on cybercrime to enable them really to detect when they may be subjected to types of cybercrime. For example, phishing emails, and that we would advise things like penetration testing can help your organisation to identify those emails. If we move on, please, Melissa, that's great. So really what we would say with regards to digital transformation, thinking about where your charity has come from and where it's going, both operationally and from a fundraising perspective as well, you need to know what data you're holding. You need to know where it's stored, and you need to be confident that where it is stored is secure. Think about who can access that data. Think about how you are using digital now and going forwards, perhaps for your service delivery, meeting with your beneficiaries online. Is that going to continue? I'm sure that's something that organisations have done during the pandemic. Is that going to continue in the future? And how are you going to adopt the policies and procedures to make sure that everything is secure in that regard? Video conferencing and webinars, say for example, quite often we find that video conferencing and webinars are recorded, but you need to consider, have you received the correct permissions in order to record those conferences? And if you're going to put them up online afterwards, do you have the correct permissions and procedures in place to do that? Day-to-day operations have seen lots of change, and there's just a few examples there for you to think about. So if we move on to fundraising and communications on the next slide, there are just some examples here of the different ways that fundraising and communications have changed during the pandemic. And some of these, like cashless collections, were things which were in the offing before the pandemic, but have really been accelerated as a result. Website buttons and text to donate services have also seen a significant increase. So may I encourage you all to think about, how has your organisation and the way it fundraises changed as a result of the pandemic, and what will you keep and what will you lose going forwards? All of these on the screen here I think are quite positive, and some of them are quite forward thinking, but a lot has been lost by the pandemic as well. If we think about the benefits of meeting peers and networking and sharing ideas at events and conferences, and also marathons is an interesting one, isn't it? So we had marathons online during the pandemic. I'm not sure perhaps those will happen going forward. So it was lovely to see the London Marathon on the television recently. If we move on, please, Melissa. That's great, thank you. Lovely. So this final slide then really brings together all the different types of fundraising regulation that you need to think about. And there's some useful links here, as Kate had some useful links earlier. There's some good reading on this slide to help you understand legal requirements, because there is a lot to think about. I think when used responsibly, technology can play a really important part in expanding the reach of charitable fundraising appeals. And there's plenty of guidance available from the Fundraising Regulator and others to help explain how to use online fundraising platforms really, and help those messages become clear when you're using those. Yeah, you've got clear messages going forwards with regards to how you are using public funds for your organisation. And so finally, my final word on the topic of fundraising and regulation, as we've counted through, is really, you know, collecting the right data can transform an organisation. Collecting the wrong data can unfortunately drive unwanted behaviours and decrease impact, leading, of course, to possible reputational damage and untimely, ultimately failure, perhaps, to deliver that mission and objects that we've been talking about. So I'll leave you to think about that going forwards, and I believe that takes us to question time.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, Jonathan and Kate. I do please feel free to raise your questions, and that was a very interesting session. But perhaps if I could start off, because I think from my perspective, I've seen ethical investment, I've seen social investment, I'm seeing responsible investment, ESG. Jonathan, how does a charity navigate its way through all of that?
Well, you wouldn't be alone in thinking that. I think the jargon has not been helpful along the way, and I think that's partly driven by the pace with which change has happened. And the things that you've described are actually different, and that is in part gives rise to confusion, because I suspect in large part when from an investor perspective as a charity, if you're investing in ESG investments, you might think that has ethical dimension to it, and it need not necessarily be the case. As I say, it is really about methodology and the practice. So if you're a widget factory making widgets, at the end of the day, you're still going to make widgets, even if you have a good ESG rating. So there's not necessarily any positive social impact derived from the creation of the widgets themselves, but it will be about the methodology and the practice that went into creating those widgets in terms of whether they adhere to proper standards in the workplace, you know, in terms of thinking about things like pollution and carbon emissions, and the robustness of their governance. These are questions which don't necessarily get looked at outside of the context of ESG. Whereas ethical, of course, you'd be talking about, well, we're not going to invest in that company because it pollutes, or we're not going to invest in gambling because gambling is bad. And that doesn't really take into account the methodology behind the output necessarily. It is more about the service or the product itself to which you object. So ethical and ESG do sit in, you know, are sisters, but they're not necessarily one and the same thing. And impact investing is different again, where you're investing in an organization or outfit, the outcome of which is going to advance your social mission in some ways and produce a positive social impact, whether that be through training or skills, or maybe because it's creating a new technology that will have a positive outcome for your beneficiaries. So it's a very confusing world, and I think it is one which I think trustees will be forgiven for getting confused, and especially when some of this terminology sounds increasingly similar, and indeed is constantly changing. So I think it's a very good question.
Thanks, Jonathan. And it sounds like, on a similar vein, Kate, there's a question for you around reading Macmillan's EDI. It talks of investing to meet the needs of seldom heard communities with limited resources. Can you provide some insight how a charity I serve can find out more about who those seldom heard communities may be? Is there much publicly available documentation? And that's from the RSPCA in Norwich.
Yeah, so it's a very good question. Actually, I think the way that Macmillan perhaps have phrased it is slightly misleading, but from their perspective, their sort of seldom heard communities are what their beneficiary who their beneficiaries are, who they're trying to reach, who are the people that they aren't reaching. So whether or not that's people who are suffering with cancer but whose voices haven't been heard, and they're looking at who they are trying to looking at their beneficiary classes and trying to reflect that in where they look in their governance. From the perspective of the RSPCA, and the sort of the regional representation there, I suppose it's looking at where the city that you serve, and whether or not you've got some available data from just generally from the council about who has animals and pets and things like this, and what sort of community you are sitting amongst, and whether or not you are managing to reach everyone and giving support to those people in your community. As to online resources, I think it depends probably about but it probably depends where you are in the country, but I imagine perhaps thinking more towards the sort of the council available resources, or actually looking at the demographic of where you sit amongst, and whether or not you're able to reflect that in your own governance is something that you probably may be the best place to start. Or reach out to charities like you, or other charities in your community. They may have a resource, because everyone's sort of trying to get to the same end. And I think that's the lovely thing about working in the third sector, that everyone's very willing to share their own experiences, which is why I pointed everyone towards the Macmillan story. So hopefully that's helpful. If not, we can have a chat.
Thank you, Kate. And you were talking about changing the governing document. Seen some governing documents that are quite old. I've seen ones that are quite new. Do you find that that's an area that's now increased in workflows with you where you are as the pandemic?
Not necessarily with the pandemic. I think charity, a sort of a gear change in anything that a charity is looking to do, normally at the back of a governance review, but it seems to come quite steadily. I've not say, I don't know if you would agree, Jonathan, but we've not necessarily noticed anyone wanting to change that significantly. It's more about when the charity is able to give itself the space and time to think about what they're actually doing, and whether or not what they have reflects that properly, because you can sort of operate around the core of your governance, but if you're able to pin that back onto those documents and make sure that everyone is clear on the mission, I find that sort of helps charities really find cost savings and things like this, and just sort of move towards more efficiency, but nothing particular out of the pandemic that's meant that has changed at all. Do you agree, Jonathan?
I would agree. Yeah, it's not been. I don't think it's been a focus area, funny enough, constitutional change during the pandemic.
No, it's so important.
Yeah, to us, we might raise it, but I think because the pandemic itself has caused such a colossal change in work practices, that inevitably looking at governance inevitably will become a part of that process, because I think it started with a shift in activities, and then trying to accommodate that within your governance structure has required a shift. And we saw, I mean, the thing that we saw the most, of course, was the people trying to convene meetings and hold meetings, and then realizing potentially that their constitution didn't permit that, and that's when the Commission and indeed Companies House helpfully stepped in, and that, funnily enough, did cause people to look at their constitution and think like, what is this? Anyway, I didn't know this was there, or that we were constrained in this way. So some of those questions have arisen out of it, sort of in a sideways way.
Thanks, Jonathan. And Suzanne, you mentioned tying in the strategic reports into the accounts and the actions, and that, I guess, flows through to fundraising too, and where it fits in an organisation. Would you like to add to that at all?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the annual report and accounts really can be seen as a good tool to highlight the work of your organisation during the year. And that trustees report, as I said, it ties in the numbers, but it also ties in what you're about, what you're there for, how you've achieved that during the year. which is very, very important. It's also important, you know, as to help explain that fundraising ask going forward. So I spoke briefly about the reserves policy. I think that was one of your stats, Helena, that came out of your review. In fact, it was one of the higher stats that came out of your review, which is great, because that's something that you and I have been talking to our clients about now for a number of years, really explaining if you've got reserves, why have you got reserves? Why do you need reserves? How much reserves do you need, and how far adrift are you from that level? And the pandemic has really heightened that awareness for sure between organisations, and I'm sure we'll see that disclosure going forwards increase as well.
Because one of the things talking about ESG ratings and charities thinking, well, how are we going to think about our own ESG rating? And one of the things I probably should have said during my part was that a lot of what charities are doing is actually already thinking along these lines. They may not call it that, but obviously charitable organisations, through their SORP and through their governance practices and adhering to the governance code, it's already thinking about the number of things which are already part of the ESG story. They may not necessarily be thinking about, well, is there an environmental byproduct to what we're doing that we haven't thought about? That part might not be there, but questions about diversity, clear decision making, transparency of numbers, these sorts of things are all part of the ESG story. So I think as things go forward, it probably wouldn't take too much re-engineering to start to move a little bit further down that road, you know, especially relative to the private sector, where these sorts of things are not front and center in the same way at all.
That's interesting. That could maybe feed into the sort of consultation, perhaps, is thinking about what does ESG mean for charities, because I know that concept of impact reporting is a little bit difficult to pin down as to exactly what it means. I'm very conscious of the time, so I just wondered whether you all wanted to have a final say of anything that you would encourage our delegates to take away. Jonathan, I didn't know if you wanted to start.
Well, I would just plug our next event in 2 weeks' time, which is going to be another sort of slimline canter through some issues, and I think it will be picking up the baton on digital and data protection and that thorny chestnut that all organisations have to wrestle with, as we touched on earlier today. But we'll be doing a slightly deeper dive on that. And if you didn't see last week's, was it last week's we did one? It will be on. I'll plug it on YouTube, so you can see that as well. And that was, what was that on? It was employment matters, the new working practices. Yeah, no, that had lots of good stuff in it. So I would just signpost that to anybody who might be interested.
Thanks, Jonathan. And Kate?
I'm very passionate about making sure charities use their opportunities they've been given, and there's a lot of goodwill towards charities at the moment, riding the back of the wave of what Suzanne's spoken to us, and I think now is a good opportunity. Yes, we can share the YouTube via email, yes, just taking the time to take a step back and ensure charities are sort of equipped and streamlined for getting ready for the next chapter. I just think this autumn presents a really good chance to do that, and I would encourage everyone to just put it on the agenda for your next trustee meeting. It doesn't have to be complicated, it just has to start the conversation.
Thank you, Kate. And finally, Suzanne.
Yes, I would say think about your organisation, how it's been affected by the pandemic, where is your income coming from in the future, and make sure that you're using that holistic approach, tying in what you're doing with your mission and objectives, and that everybody knows the great work that you're doing.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much to all of our speakers today. I hope you enjoyed our session. This is session 2 of 4, as Jonathan highlighted, so we would really look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.